Good afternoon, again. We are privileged today to be joined by 4 former United States ambassadors to Latvia, in Silinch, James Holmes, Brian Carlson, and Nancy Pettit, as well as the current Latvian ambassador to the United States, Madis Selga. In the period of Latvia's renewed independence, which has lasted about 30 years, there have been only 10 persons who have served as U.S. ambassadors to Latvia. So we have assembled today fully 40% of the ambassadors' roster. And it's really a powerhouse group, and it should be very interesting. As mentioned, my name is Peter Blombergs, and I've worked with some of the ambassadors in my year, 1 year with the World Federation of Free Latvians, but also I was the president of the American Latvian Association for 6 years. We'll be discussing today the experiences of the ambassadors in terms of the major events of their eras in Latvia, and we'll hear about the government leaders and personalities, both in America and Latvia, that they interacted with while in their positions. I will also ask them specific questions about current events and how their time in Latvia differs from today's world, or whether anything they saw may have forecasted the current global order. You have biographies of each of the panelists in your program, so I will not repeat that information now, but instead I will give you a very brief introduction of each speaker in chronological order, and I'm actually going to introduce all of you right now so that I can stop talking and you can hear the people you came to hear. And then they will follow with some opening remarks and describe their tenure in Latvia and the notable events of their era. And like I said, this will be done in chronological order of their tenure in Latvia. So the first speaker will be Ince Silinch, who was the first ambassador American ambassador following renewed independence. He's also the only, I believe, Latvian American ambassador ever to Latvia. Ince served from 1992 to 1995. Then we will hear from James Holmes, who was ambassador from 1998 to 2001. He was in place, I note, during the first wave of NATO enlargement to Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic. Brian Carlson served from 2001 to 2005. That was an era when Latvia joined NATO in 2004. And then we'll jump ahead 10 years to Nancy Pettit, who served from 2015 to 2019. And she presided over I would call it a turbulent time of Russian aggression and a Trump presidency where transatlantic relations were sometimes openly questioned. At this time, I also wanted to recognize Ambassador Pettit's husband, Ambassador James Pettit, who is with us today too. He was a former U.S. ambassador to Moldova. Finally, we'll hear from Madis Selga, who has been ambassador to the United States from Latvia since 2019, a period marked, of course, by a global pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I will, each of you has your own microphone, and so I will now turn it over to Ince for some opening remarks.
Okay.
You might need this.
No. I'm going to stand. I was told that we have only a few minutes for opening remarks, so no monologues. But I still want to do 3 different things. I want to give you just a lightning sketch of what the situation was like facing me when I got to Latvia to open an embassy in September 1991. Secondly, talk a little bit about why are we celebrating diplomatic relations. To most people, that's not a big deal. And I want to tip my hat to Oyar's Kalnic, who died last year. Okay, when I arrived in Riga, the situation is one that might have caused general panic. There had been an attempt by the Soviet special forces to snuff out the independence movement. There were still bullet holes visible in the building that became our temporary embassy, the Reason Hotel. The economy was tanking. They had no currency in effect because they were in the ruble zone, now no longer. They had the whole question of forming a government out of old communist pieces, communist people, communist structures. They had the number sticks in mind, this may be wrong, 138,000 or so Russian soldiers in Latvia, not just hostile, but unpaid in many cases, which makes people very edgy. In other words, really a lot of stuff that had to get done. I do not want to claim that it got done only because I was there. In fact, Latvia showed an amazing resiliency and calm despite the situation. It looked bad, there were still barricades, as I say, but people were slowly picking up the pieces and going about their work. They did, I think, an excellent job in forming a government out of the existing elements. For example, Anatolis Gorbanovs, who was the first leader, was very well suited to the job, although he had a pretty high Communist Party position, I believe, before. So there was this transition into something like a democratic country. Now, we, that is the US, had to get involved in some things, even including domestic politics, because there was a very sharp split between the, what shall we call them, very nationalist Latvians, anti-Russian nationalist Latvians, very understandable, and those who were a little more pragmatic over the question of troop withdrawals. Both of them wanted troop withdrawals, but there was a very sharp argument about whether or not Latvia should sign an agreement with the Soviet Union, with Russia, to bring that about. It was our position, the US position, it was very important to do that because that would give some legal basis, some structure to that agreement. In this case, I got involved in herding a group of leaders of the political parties to Washington for meetings that involved everybody. They were treated like an Israeli parliamentary delegation. They saw everybody, including at the end a meeting with the Swedish ambassador, who continued the argument that, guys, you really need to do this. And so it actually did happen. So I think let's use that part of the time. Let me talk now about why are we celebrating, and we are celebrating. This is a joyous event. 100 years of diplomatic relations between Latvia and the US. Normally diplomats are associated with cocktail parties, speaking rather not directly. So why celebrate this? We have relations with even unfriendly countries. The difference, of course, was the Sumner-Wells Declaration, which linked the relations to non-recognition, which was an implicit promise. It was a commitment and promise that the US would stand behind Latvia's efforts to maintain its independence, even as the US recognized its representatives in Washington, but not those who took power in Riga. So it's well worth celebrating. It's well worth also thinking about how diplomatic relations aren't such a frivolous thing after all. They, in fact, are often the only thing that prevents war between countries. So they should be taken seriously. Finally, why did the US remain firm? Partly because of people like you, who convinced people in America, not just officials in the government or in the Congress, but the public, that Latvia and the other Baltic states were a cause worth supporting. They were charming. They sang well. They could actually get along too. That very important image was that chain of hands celebrating the opposition to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Remember in 1989, in August, the hands were linked all the way from Estonia to Lithuania. And that's a powerful image. Also, the fact that these countries were making rapid progress toward the kind of values and structures and beliefs that rule here in the US was very important. It was critical. People like you helped to keep that alive. Which brings me to my third subject. Ojārs Kalniņš was one of those who made really a terrific contribution to that fight to keep the image of Latvia brightly in front of America. He and I were sort of an only in America kind of mirror image. We're both Latvian, although he was born in Germany, I was born in Riga. He renounced his American citizenship to be an ambassador from Latvia to the US. I postponed exercising my right to Latvian citizenship so I could be the American ambassador. But in terms of working with the public on behalf of Latvia, Ajaris was way ahead of me, and he's a great boss. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. In an early telephone conversation, Ed said to me, 100 years of diplomatic recognition and diplomatic exchange, no mean thing to celebrate. And I say that with a big smile on my face. It is no mean achievement, 100 years under the circumstances in which prevailed at numerous times. Now let me give you a little bit of what I would describe as capturing my experience in Latvia in just 7 words. Gratitude, friendship, transition, NATO, flowers, music, architecture. Now 5 of these qualities, gratitude, friendship, flowers, music, and architecture, gave us, my wife Connie and I, great joy throughout our years in Riga. 2, transition in NATO, required enormous work and effort over more than a decade, and that which continues even today, but as we are seeing every day, is most consequential. I want to give you 2 anecdotes as testimonies to these qualities and as chronological bookends to my 3 years in Latvia. The first was on National Day in November 1998. I had been in Latvia but a few weeks, and the government of Latvia had decided that for the first time, it would have a military parade on the 11 November embankment along the river as the centerpiece of its observance. It was a bitterly cold day, which cut down on both the participants and the crowd. Although I remember being impressed that so many people showed up and lustily cheered on a day when the dogwood actually froze over. At one point, then President Ulmanis spoke to me privately about NATO membership. Quote, "It's an aspiration of all the Baltic states," he said, "but not very realistic in terms of Latvia. Latvia has very little military of its own and few resources. Perhaps Lithuania," he said, "will be able to qualify in the years ahead," but he didn't see it for Latvia. As luck would have it, I had talked with Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbot about this before heading to Riga. I used with President Ulmanis Strobe's guidance to me, and I looked at my notes to make sure that I got it right. Strobe said, "The Baltics have made their choice. Tell them to go on making their choice and making it known. The U.S. will keep working with the Brits and Germans regarding NATO, and we will continue to rely on the American constituency for the Baltics for political support. But don't appear to be anything other than calm and confident about the outcome." Fat fingers, old age. And now for the other bookend. 3 years later, September 11, 2001. My wife Connie and I were due to depart Riga the next day at the end of our tour. Partway through an afternoon farewells reception at the embassy, my security officer told me of the first plane crash into the World Trade Center tower. We thought it a tragic accident and continued with the reception. Several minutes later, he advised of the second plane crash into the second tower, and it was apparent that this was no accident. We halted the reception. Then word of the attack on the Pentagon in Shanksville. America was under attack. We reeled, even in Riga. I spent that night at the embassy. From my second-story window, I watched as crowds assembled outside the front gate, lighting candles and leaving flowers. One gentleman played the Star-Spangled Banner on his accordion over and over again. Through the night, the mound of flowers grew, and when I walked back across the park to our apartment in the morning, scores of Latvians called out their condolences. All flights were canceled. We remained in Riga, but surrounded by friendship, flowers, and music. President Vika Freiberger invited Connie and me to her home for dinner, with her husband and moms, just the four of us. The people of Riga mourned with us in a service of friendship and shared sympathy at the magnificent Dome Cathedral, attended by all the ecclesiastical, government, and local leaders and several thousand citizens of Riga. It brought it all together. Flowers, music, friendship, gratitude, transition, architecture. I thought then, and so often since, of that tragic yet beautiful irony. A diplomatic relationship that had weathered decades of Soviet occupation, and for me had begun with heartfelt notions of what we, the United States, and I as the ambassador, could do for and give to the nation and people of Latvia. That it should end with the United States as the recipients of Latvia's friendship, music, flowers, and gratitude.
Well, I experienced Latvia very different, but let me start back a little bit earlier. In 1992, in January, I was in charge of the office in our government agency that was setting up new embassies, and I sent a young man named Jim Kenny, who could not go to Yugoslavia because they were shooting at people there, and we sent him instead to Latvia to start up the public diplomacy program of education, cultural exchanges, and all that sort of thing. And he did an excellent job, picking very good people, and he even picked out the American Library on Smilsujila and got that project underway to get that established. I remember particularly because I went out in, I think it was January of '92, to visit Latvia and see how things were going. Probably the Russians. I remember seeing Russian army vehicles, with the Red Star and everything in the streets of Riga, which came as something of a surprise to me. I had not thought about the fact that they would still be in the city. I mean, I knew they were in bases, but I hadn't expected to see them around in the streets and so forth. And anyway, that struck me at that time. When I returned to Riga, it was 2001, and right after 9/11. And as you can imagine, there was a lot of consternation in Washington about what American policy would be and what we would do after 9/11. And at one point, we went back to the president and Connie Rice, and we said, so where do we stand now on NATO enlargement? There was some debate in the United States about whether or not it was a good idea to expand NATO further, and whether this would have an impact on U.S.-Russian relations and so forth. And the president was very firm. He said, we can do two things at once. Go ahead. And that was my marching orders. And I carried those out to Riga, and we did exactly that. Firmly, I had enormous support and assistance, first of all, on the Latvian side, of course, President Vika Freiberger and all the ministers and foreign ministers and so forth. But also the general population was enormously supportive of the idea of NATO. when we ran into problems, it was often as much from the American or the European side, where people were raising objections or questions about whether or not this was a good idea. And I would explain sometimes when we ran into difficulties over things like citizenship or language rules and things like that, be a NATO ally, then we have to be able to trust that everything in the country, or virtually everything in the country, works well. That is, that contracts are honored, that people do what they say they're going to do, that government purchases are made openly with transparency, and all of those, that citizens are treated fairly and equitably and so forth, and people have rights and all of that sort of thing. And so we spent a lot of time reassuring congressmen. We had almost continual visits by John McCain, Lindsey Graham, Susan Collins, and a bunch of senators and so forth who came out very frequently, and members of the House of Representatives as well, all interested in how were we doing and how were the Latvians doing on issues, everything from recognition of Holocaust and history and all of that sort of thing. And of course we had wonderful support from Morris and people at the Foreign Ministry on all of this. So in the end, in 2004, toward the end of my tour, we actually celebrated, or Latvia actually celebrated, first the admission to NATO in the 29th of March in 2004, and then on the 1st of May, admission to the European Union. And I must say that if I look back and I think about the way the European Union asked Latvia to conform in terms of laws and regulations and procedures to European standards, and the way we insisted that part of the way to get into NATO was to conform to NATO standards of legal activities and not just the military, but on all standards of government operations. That was what did it. And that was a celebratory time. And I must say, I think in some ways I have one of the easiest of the assignments as an ambassador. You too?
There we go. Okay. Good afternoon. I almost feel like we're talking about a different country here. When I listen to the way Latvia was, and then compare it to my experience, it really, Latvia is an incredible success story. When I arrived, I was appointed by President Obama, and Latvia had already been in NATO for 10 years. We saw Latvia as our ally, partner, and friend. During my tenure, Latvia had troops with us in Afghanistan and in Iraq. They were working with the Michigan National Guard to train troops in Liberia. Through an EU mission, they had peacekeeping troops in Mali. They had troops in the Central African Republic. Latvia had really stepped up to the plate in every possible way. So we were very focused on NATO and on the defense and security of Latvia because Russia, unfortunately, was extremely aggressive during my tenure, and in 2014, as you know, had invaded Crimea and had started fighting in eastern Ukraine already. And Russia was also very active in cyber warfare against Latvia. I think that's the only way to describe it, as well as on social media and directing tremendous amounts of propaganda through television, radio, newspaper, trying to create tremendous divisions between Russian speakers and Latvian speakers. And Russia's intention was to create as much chaos and division as possible. So, our approach via NATO was to establish the EFP, which is the Enhanced Forward Presence, which is still there today. Canada has the lead, And when I was there, there was Canada plus 6 other countries which had troops at Attaché base, as well as U.S. troops at L'Île Garde and at Attaché. Today, it's already up to a dozen countries that have troops on the ground in Latvia, in addition to heel-to-toe rotations for U.S. troops in Latvia. American troops arrived when I was there in Latvia by air, by ship, by road. I witnessed hundreds of U.S. troops parachuting into the country. It was the most incredible spectacle. I participated, I flew on a Black Hawk helicopter, which was in the country. We did in-air refueling missions. I mean, it was just really incredible because Latvia welcomed training with U.S. troops and with NATO troops and gave us a real opportunity to do training that we couldn't do in the United States. The Michigan State partnership with Latvia was absolutely crucial, and I was very grateful to the attention that we received from the state of Michigan, including visits by Michigan senators, by Governor Snyder, and to, I think, demonstrate to all in Latvia and also to Latvia's neighbors the strength of our relationship. We had Vice President Biden come visit in 2016 to Latvia. Vice President Pence came to Estonia, but it was a Latvia-wide, a Baltic-wide meeting. We had Senator McCain, Senator Graham, Senator Klobuchar. I met with more generals than I thought possible. Every other day I was meeting with a general. So I think that these high-level visits, which culminated in the Baltic presidents going to the White House in 2018 to celebrate the centennial, really signaled the strength of U.S.-Latvian diplomatic relations, because it doesn't get any higher and better than that, a trip to the White House. On the resilience side of things, the embassy always worked very closely with Latvia to develop or to answer challenges regarding resilience issues that I saw mostly as Soviet legacy issues, like a shadow economy that accounted for about 25% of economic activity, addressing issues in the banking sector, addressing just the, I'd say, the environment for trade and investment. So we worked closely with the Latvian government. We liked to bring experts in to share best practices. I think a lot of these issues are being addressed now, and I'm just very proud of the wonderful and close relationship that I had all 4 years. For me, the challenge was not Latvia. For me, the challenge was Washington. It was a very chaotic time in U.S. history, in U.S. diplomatic history. There was a lot of mixed messages and mixed signals coming from the United States, but I can say that the U.S. Congress was always steadfast in its support for Latvia and for all the Baltics, and I think that the challenges that Latvia faced, because it was in the EU and because it had gone through the process of getting new laws on the books, it had a very good basis to address its challenges, and I still feel that way. And I look forward to just seeing what's going to happen in the next few years. Of course, there are demographic challenges in Latvia. We're all well aware of those. While I was there, Latvia was still recovering from the 2008-2009 world financial collapse, and was still recovering in 2015 when I arrived. But I do believe that Latvia has a very, very bright future, and I know that this wonderful bilateral relationship with the U.S. will continue. Thanks.
shorter because my distinguished colleagues has told everything about Latvia, so I probably have to say something about United States. Well, it's, you know, if you have to tango, you need at least two, you know, so that otherwise. Anyway, I had the pleasure, I mean, half of my diplomatic, career as a foreign minister, I think half of it has been devoted to United States. I think in 1995, Ambassador Silinch had given by then Foreign Minister Birka's farewell lunch, so I was part of that lunch as well. And I think with Ambassador Petit, we had a very nice event before BC, so it's called before COVID. We had a nice event at the embassy when we awarded her with the Latvian State Award of 3 stars order. I just wanted probably to mention a couple of things. I mean, first, of course, is that behind you, you see an exhibition which has been prepared by our historians in Latvia. That's actually an exhibition on diplomatic relations between Latvia and the United States. So that's, I think it's those who have been at the embassy on Wednesday have seen it for the first time. Now it's, I think, second time in the United States. So that will stay open also tomorrow as well. So you are welcome to check those data and look at the photos. Maybe you can recognize yourself somewhere. So I wanted also to mention that what Peter has mentioned at the beginning is that he counted the ambassadors only after the Second World War. I mean, so there are 15 ambassadors from the United States, I mean, altogether in Latvia. So I started with the first ambassador, Frederick Coleman, which my spouse is actually doing PhD on that ambassador who was...
We invited them, but they didn't respond.
Right. So she can tell you everything about Coleman, but that will take a couple of more hours, so anyway. So, and I mean, there has been 12 ambassadors from Latvia to United States, starting from 1922. So, you know, the interesting part, of course, is that this Latvian Foreign Service, because of Sumner Wells Declaration, existed for 100 years, so that it has never been interrupted. So because we have Latvian flag has always flown, I mean, by Department of State. When I arrived in 2004, for the first time I was Deputy Chief of Mission in the United States. United States were, of course, a little bit different, so that was after 9/11, and we were all, as President Bush said, that we are at war, so that was, you know, war with terror, with terrorists. I mean, so we were helping United States to deal with that issue as much we could before joining NATO, and of course afterwards as well. But when I came back to United States in 2019, I was surprised because United States has changed a little bit. And when I landed directly, I mean, that was direct flight from Beijing. So I landed in the United States in Washington, D.C. So the first surprise for me was how widely Spanish language is used in the United States. So you probably will never recognize Spanish as your official or second official language in the United States, but it was, you know, very surprising for me personally, you know, to see and to hear actually Spanish around. Actually, when I went to shopping malls, the outlets, I mean, there was also Chinese language. That has disappeared, but Spanish, of course, is very widely used, so that was, let's say, the change. If you are not speaking about political changes in the United States and in society, the change which I noticed as well. So I will probably also would like to mention that there has been 5, if you count the future presidents and former presidents who has visited Latvia. So starting with Hoover, JFK, and of course President Clinton in 1994, President Bush twice, and as you mentioned, Vice President Biden. So we can say that, you know, 5 presidents has visited our country. And if I can just use the couple of things that Ambassador Holmes mentioned, you know, how he remembers Latvia with those 7 words, I would probably say about Latvian contribution to the United States. That would be music, architecture, art, including theater and cinema, food. If you eat Pringles, you know those are Latvian made. airlines, of course NATO as well, and even you couldn't survive without Miss United States in 1963. She was Latvia. So that's probably, 100 years, I think it's a long time, and I think that we have something to celebrate. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Really interesting remarks from all of you. I'm going to pose a few questions, and then also I forgot to mention that we do plan to have a Q&A that the audience can participate in at the end. So think about any questions you might have, and especially if I don't cover anything. Looking out into the audience and seeing Carl Alto, the executive director of J-Bank, it reminds me of how when we have organized numerous J-Bank conferences over the years, we always start out with, the first panel is always what we call the red meat panel, which is a panel about Russia, and usually Putin, because he's been around a long time. Putin was the prime minister, first elected or became prime minister in 1999, and served in that role for 2 years. Then in 2000 was elected president of Russia for the first of several terms. And so he didn't overlap with Ince necessarily, but he came on the scene around the time of James's and Brian's tenures. Any memories of him from that era? What did you think of him? Could you predict what he would become?
Should have left it on. Short answer is no. Great interest, mystification. People at that time thought, well, this may be the next generation. He's experienced. Russia's been through a very rough time. It's demonstrably weak. Things have moved ahead in terms of the relationship. We have a long-term objective of integrating a number of former Soviet satellites and republics into the NATO. We'll simply plow ahead, and I think that probably this new leadership in Russia will understand, and they want to become more Western themselves, and they'll be accommodated. 100% wrong. We did not understand then, and I think it's taken the better part of 2 decades for us to understand that there's something deep and intrinsic with respect to Putin and his leadership and his support in Russia, which has made for a very difficult transition, and one which certainly complicated the process, but in my view, gives enormous credit to those who have been able to persist in Latvia despite.
I never met him, so I never looked into his eyes. And I guess I've always, I dealt with a lot of Russian ethnic Latvians when I was there. We even did a major project. Coming up next year is the 110th, is that right? No, 120th birthday of the artist Mark Rothko, who came from Daugavpils when it wasn't maybe Latvia at that time. But and we actually, during my time, well, first of all, we got a major exhibit of Mark Rothko's works, most of which had never traveled before. And with the help of the Rothko family, as well as the National Gallery of Art and the Tate in London, we got a loan of 21 works by Mark Rothko and brought them to Latvia. And we also did a major conference in Daugavpils. And the remarkable thing about that, it was the first time most of the people from the culture ministry, as well as the sort of cultural group, or what do I call it, the cultural people in Latvia, artists and so forth, and art critics and so forth, had been to Latvia. So I hope that's no longer true, that people get around a little more. I think I always believed that Father Time is going to take care of a lot of Latvia's interethnic problems and so forth. That the younger generation has a much different attitude than the older.
Let me, I see In's ready to answer too, but I wanted to throw something to Ambassador Pettit, because you presided in Latvia and dealt with Putin and Russia at a time that I would describe as probably the most polarizing time in American politics, at least in my lifetime, where you took over during you said you were nominated by President Obama, and you know, Republicans, Trump supporters would say that he was way too soft on Russia, and then Democrats, when Trump came in, would say Trump is way too cozy with Putin. What did you think? Who was right?
As I just mentioned in my remarks, I arrived in Latvia right after Crimea, and that really shaped the next 4 years. And what I saw was an onslaught approach by Putin to do whatever he could to sow divisions. Excuse me. I think that the message, which was repeated night and day by Russian media, was that Latvia was a failed state that treated its Russian speakers as second-class citizens. And this simply wasn't true. Of course, it's true that about 35 to 37% of people who live in Latvia speak Russian, but this doesn't mean anything other than they speak Russian. They may also speak Latvian. They may be extremely supportive of Latvia. Of course they are, because they're living there. If they weren't supportive, they would have moved back to Russia. About 11% of the population in Latvia when I was there were non-citizens. And again, Latvia used that, Russia used that to criticize Latvia. But this group of people, about 11%, either they didn't want to become Latvian citizens, or they were unable to do so because they wouldn't be able to pass the Latvian language test. But a lot of them were fine just, not having Latvian citizenship. They didn't care. And we're talking, again, kind of the elderly population. So I would say that, I saw Putin with his gloves off, and he was busy with cyber attacks against all the Baltic countries and doing everything he could to destabilize democracy in the Baltics. And his notion of this Ruski mir, this Russian world where anyone who speaks Russian needs to be protected by Russia, was destabilizing and used as an excuse. I mean, that's the excuse he used to go into Crimea. And it created a stable political situation. The Russians were constantly holding exercises close to the border. Every year they did an enormous exercise. And they threatened the sense of security in the Baltics. So those are my comments.
And did you want to address this?
Just briefly, back to the red meat. I did not have to deal with Putin, thank God, while I was ambassador to Latvia. I have not met him. I've done a certain amount of reading and thinking about him and observing what he's up to. And I'm leaning toward the view that he really would like to be the modern Ivan Terrible, Peter the Great, what have you, who reconstitutes not so much the Soviet Union exactly, but better than that, the Russian Empire. And Ukraine is an essential part of that for him. So he started there. There is a well, let me skip that for a moment. But he needs to go further, and is likely to go further, if he hadn't stubbed his toe badly in Ukraine. That puts him, in my mind, in a very odd and unstable psychological situation, because whether or not he started out as a very self-disciplined KGB man, by now, I think being a man of absolute power in Russia, plus having paranoia, justified paranoia as to what would happen to him if he loses that power, makes him really very difficult to predict. So he's definitely a menace. There was a book written by General Sir Richard Shirreff called War with Russia. Shirreff was the deputy commander of the Allied Forces Europe during the time that Putin took over Crimea. After he retired, which was shortly after that, he wrote a novel, which I recommend to you as both entertainment and information, about a scenario very similar to what happened, at least started off, an attack first on Ukraine, and then a turn immediately toward the Baltic states, beginning with Riga. So that is a danger that is still not ready to be handled by NATO. He wrote it because he knew NATO, based on wargaming, was not able to handle it, and it's a warning that it should strengthen up.
I'm going to go ahead to a related topic that has been kind of referenced a little bit, and Mad, maybe you can comment on this one too, and that is NATO. And so this summer at the Madrid summit, NATO made several major pronouncements. They expanded on troop commitments to the Baltics and Poland and other regions. There's a commitment to expand NATO to Sweden and Finland. A lot of NATO support in Ukraine. Does more need to be done? And really the question is Latvia secure?
Maybe I can start. I mean, if we look at Russia's war in Ukraine, as unfortunate thing, I mean, the happening it is, I mean, so the best thing that came out, it's that Sweden and Finland joining NATO, so I think that will probably bring Baltic Sea region, or Baltics and Nordics in general, I mean, the security environment will be much better than it before. As you know, apart from Baltics and before, during the Cold War, there was only one country neighboring Russia, that was Norway, and the border was very short. Now with the Finnish border, I think that will conclude that circle around Russia, and Russia probably, unfortunately, will be enclosed by NATO countries, which is good for Latvia. So regarding all NATO Madrid summit, I think that let's say sentences what we are always using is that we need U.S. presence in the Baltics. So that's what we are always saying and probably will say. And I think that Madrid summit and what ambassadors mentioned regarding EFP and in Canada, I think is bringing this decision and solution closer by the day. So of course that we have to find out how it will happen. It will be permanent rotation basis, as our Lithuanian colleagues are saying differently. So, but I think that's what we are looking forward. But I think we do feel much safer, of course, being in NATO than it was before 2004.
Brian?
I completely agree. When we were on the verge of Latvia's admission to NATO, the subject came up of air cover, combat air patrols. And it turned out that what was going on is the Russians were flying up and down the Baltic and around the corner of Estonia and so forth, and flying into Estonian and Latvian airspace on a regular basis, and increasingly so, taking in more. And of course, we had always told Latvia and Estonia, when they even began thinking about joining NATO, don't build yourself an air force. That's way too expensive, and we got far too many planes already. So, you don't need your own air force. But then the question came up, well, okay, NATO airspace needs to be controlled by NATO. We don't let other people walk in, and abuse the privilege and so forth. So how are we going to handle this? And there were some people in some of the militaries in NATO who said, well, we can't afford to, put airplanes over Latvia and Estonia and so forth. And how do we deal with when we run into a Russian or whatever? Well, fortunately, this became something of an inside NATO debate. But fortunately, we had the support of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Jones, who was SACEUR, and Nick Burns, who was our ambassador to NATO at the time. And we argued very strongly that, hey, we got to do this. This is part of being part of NATO is both an obligation on Latvia and Estonia to do their part, but it's also on the part of all the NATO allies to do their part. And so on the, I think it was in the end of March or maybe the 1st of April, we actually had overflights by, I think we started with French Air Force. And the French Air Force overflew, and we pushed back, and the Russians had quit pushing into Latvian and Estonian airspace. And to me, this is simply a very small but symbolic answer to the way you have to deal with an aggressive country like, or an aggressive leader like Putin. You've got to push back. And as Tom Pickering, the famous American diplomat, said just the other day, it is the job of the diplomats when there is conflict and war and so forth to envisage what is the political situation you want to resolve, that you want after the war is over, and then to make sure that that comes to be. And that's, I think, where we are here. We've got to make sure that what happens at the end of the battle in Ukraine is what we want it to be.
Jim, did you want to?
If you'd permit me, give it a resounding yes to your question is Latvia secure and the Baltics. And nothing could be more clear in my mind than the example of Ukraine. The fact that Latvia is a member of NATO was not inevitable. It took a lot of individual, personal effort for this to be achieved. And I want to give credit, Nancy already mentioned the Michigan National Guard. Michigan National Guard with the then Colonel Raimons Grauba, who became general over time and leader, understood that you don't do it at once, you have to do it a little bit at a time. And they started by shipping personal kits for soldiers and fixing up barracks and doing things which were actual ground level transition of the Latvian military forces. Varavika Freiberg understood that it could not happen without some support from the United States Jewish community. And that had to include recognition that there had been collaborators in Latvia with respect to the Nazi occupation. So Varavika Freiberg, Ron Asmus, who was a Deputy Secretary of State and was the architect of the Big Bang enlargement of NATO. All of these individuals, Christovskis, Defense Minister Christovskis, Rinkevich, who was then State Secretary of Defense, they all understood that it was important for Latvia to be successful in this membership drive for NATO, and that it had to be done in a gradual, bit-by-bit basis, and they undertook it on personal credibility. They undertook to deliver that sort of an outcome. So I think we have to give enormous credit, diplomatic credit over the years, to people who saw the challenge and undertook and did it bit by bit to the point where Latvia is today much more secure than it would have been without success in NATO.
Another major duty or obligation obligation of an ambassador is economic development, economic cooperation with the country that they're living in. What maybe, and you could start us off on, since you were there in the early years of the market economy in Latvia, what were some of the success stories? What's your assessment of where Latvia was there and now economically?
Well, yes, the economy certainly was an issue at the time. As I say, no currency, got to build a banking system. Latvia's economy was part of Russia, essentially, and not just a market for them, but controlling it. So there was a lot to be done. In terms of what the U.S. was involved with, one of the early things we did, once the situation got calmed down enough to where, and this happened fairly soon actually, that the eventually what was called the lat. First there was a temporary ruble, and then there was a lat, which became a very solid investment. Once that was true, then investors from outside began to get interested. And I forget now the exact date, but we set up a U.S.-Latvian Chamber of Commerce, which played a very active role in getting the ball moving. I can't, off the top of my head, call off investments and joint ventures and things that happened in those early days, but the momentum certainly began even at the time when otherwise the country was still, you would have said, in shambles.
Right.
In that regard, I would call attention to the, I think it was called the Baltic American Enterprise Fund, which was instrumental in basically introducing a lot of financial instruments, which one of the major things they did was enable Latvians to buy and refurbish and so forth their own homes. You know, most of the housing stock that was inherited from the Soviet days was in pretty sad shape. But pretty quickly, people wanted to fix things up, and they had the opportunity. This also worked into the rule of law question, that you can actually own something and hope that you actually do own it, and that you can sell it when you want to sell it, and you'll get a fair price and all that. But the Enterprise Fund provided a lot of funding and securitized mortgages and so forth, so that we could increase the number of homeowners in Latvia. And not just homes, I think it also included enterprises and farms and so forth. And of course, while I was there, we also began to see, because of the European Union, we saw farmers coming into Latvia from Europe who could, because subsidies in places like France are so high, they couldn't buy farmland in France or wherever, Holland and so forth. So very intelligent, smart young people with funds and knowledge and technology were coming into Latvia and investing in farming, because here was all this land that had actually never been treated with chemical fertilizers and so forth anyway, because the Soviets didn't bother with that. And there were all kinds of benefits that flowed back through the economic progress that was being made.
I don't know, yeah, Jim?
If I could just add another anecdote. Shortly after I arrived, an executive from Jelwin met with me in Riga, and he regaled me at length about sending a young man with a suitcase and a credit card to Riga with the simple instructions, see what you can do. And over the months and the years that followed, Jelwin found what it could do and did it well, and it developed a real community of expertise in that sector in Latvia. I would have expected 20 years ago to see multiples of that from Latvia. So I would have to say that I'm somewhat disappointed that I haven't seen more entrepreneurship coming out of Latvia, because it has the skills, it certainly has the location, it has the connectivity to be successful, and it has been unfortunately diverted in ways which I think has held back entrepreneurship in a way that it could have evolved and still can evolve in a much more robust fashion.
Nancy?
And I would just add that I think that I work very closely with the American Chamber of Commerce, and they were very specific on recommendations that they had to improve the investment environment in Latvia. For foreign investors, and there was a foreign investors council when I was there as well that worked hard on reforming laws, but a weak judiciary, I think, was off-putting to some investors. And again, the banking situation, which I understand is much better now than it had been, were impediments to a lot of foreign investment.
Madi, you wanted to?
I would say probably agree with Ambassador Holmes, but a little bit differently, so that I think that's a little bit disappointing that there is not enough US investment in Latvia. So, because that would be probably... No, I know, but...
I wear 2 hearing aids and can't hear you.
There should be more US investment in Latvia, so, or let's say in Baltic in general. So, at the beginning, Coca-Cola opened factories and they moved, they're moving out. And I do understand that Poland is much bigger market and Russia was bigger market before. Anyway, but I'm very proud, so I'm always saying, when there are, journalists, Latvian journalists in this case asking, what is the embassy's main task, in the United States? I'm always saying security, security, and security. But that security is not only defense and let's say military help and aid. So that security also is a part, when you invest money in a country, so you want that country to be stable and you want to defend that country. So that's a part of NATO and part of also of European Union, where unfortunately the United States is not a member state, but as we are calling in Latvia, and Ambassador Ziliņš probably remembers, the first Latvian foreign policy directives, that was almost 3-page document, so that's, in general you can say we need a soft and security, that's European Union, and then we needed hard security, that would be NATO. But I'm very happy that we are doing some investment in the United States. I think Printful probably is one of the best examples. So we didn't succeed with Valmiera Stickles, so with that factory in next to Atlanta. But it happens, business is business. And just for your information, there is also Latvian-US chamber in the United States, so that we are working also both directions.
I wanted to ask you about, Daugavpils was mentioned and its favorite son, Mark Rockville. I wanted to ask you about the Latgale region, which is the current ambassador to Latvia from the United States, James Carwile, has made that a point of emphasis. His staff has told him that they have tried to organize events in Latgale and to visit there as frequently as they can. But nevertheless, and this is in part because there's a concern that it's sort of getting Russified. And nevertheless, in the last election results, it did seem as if the Latgale region tended to support populist parties or Russian parties and basically was out of step with the rest of the country in terms of the people, the politicians they supported. What can be done about that? What was Latgale like in your times? Did it seem like that was a problem region at that time, or, and what are the solutions? Yeah. Nancy?
The Latgale region, when I was there, was economically depressed, and a lot of the young people were leaving, so it had an older population. That older population, in Daugavpils, for example, 93% of the city was Russian-speaking, Russian's first language, and they were getting their news and information when I was there from Russian media sources, and that was a challenge for the government of Latvia. I think that in terms of the election, the results of the election, I think, in the end, were quite positive for Latvia, and I know that they're in the process of forming a new government. We don't know what that's going to look like yet, but we should know in the next couple of days. But I think that the region could use some intense economic assistance. And the decision has already been made on education, as President Levitz in his presentation today mentioned, that all the education will be taking place in Latvia, which I think is good and very important for the future of the country. But it's in a region that is certainly a challenge.
Not entirely facetiously, I would suggest that one way in which we could help bridge the divide between different groups in Latvia is to solve the divide between different groups in the U.S. It's always been, not always, for a long time it's been my view that the U.S. has its greatest impact as a model. Not as a preacher, not as a counselor, advisor, or busybody, but as an example of the right way to do things, how to run a country that benefits as many of the people as possible. So I was very happy I was not ambassador during the Trump era. But I seriously think we need to be more modest about our ability to give advice on internal questions like that when we've put on such a bad show recently ourselves.
Well, you know, my next question was going to be along the line of what advice can we give the Latvians? So, but the yeah. Well, I was struck today by the President Levitt's wonderful message, which is every year he makes a really nice speech that is geared towards the Latvian diaspora, and he used the word reform several times. And so, what reforms do you propose, or where do you think what should be priority number one? Let's say for Prime Minister Cutting in the new government. Nancy, you were there most recently.
And okay. Oh, well, I mean, I know what they're working on. I know Prime Minister Carnage very well. He was a close friend and contact the whole time I was there. And I know he is very interested. He's an economist by training, and I know that he is very interested in improving the economy there. He has a lot on his plate. I've seen the media, Latvian media, has reported extensively on the draft government agreement, which includes addressing issues of education and healthcare, of course, economics, defense and security, just all the issues that we need to address here in the United States as well. So we have a lot in common because we have challenges in all of these areas. So I know that that's what the Prime Minister will continue to focus on, as he's already focused on the last few years.
Mahadit, do you want to propose any tips to the government?
No, I want to stay in my position for a while.
So we've been going about an hour up here, and I was wondering, maybe I would turn it over to the audience if you had any questions. There's a bunch of topics that we didn't cover that we could get into, including energy security and the demographic situation in Latvia. But I see at least one person, I feel like an auctioneer here, but I see, okay, now I see two hands. Who wants to go first? Yeah.
There's microphone, I have microphone.
We can hear you. Yeah, we can
That's
hear
fine.
you.
I'll just conduct an exercise in projection. Ambassador Holmes, it's okay. I guess I'll try to carry my voice forward. So, ladies and gentlemen, apologies. Annika? Latvian. Hello. Okay, thank you so much. Peter, thank you for giving me the first chance at the microphone. I appreciate it, and I'll lead the way on this one. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much, distinguished panelists, Your Excellencies. Thank you for your remarks and your insights today. I would be remiss if I did not say it to Ambassador Holmes. Sir, it's good to see you again. I first met you as a young Latvian American on the Allah's Sveika Latvia program back in the 90s, and so here we are today. My name is Dinas Butners. I am a proud Latvian American. I'm also an Afghan veteran of the NATO ISAF mission, as well as the Georgetown School of Foreign Service, and I've just recently completed my tour of duty with U.S. European Command in Poland and in Germany. We all have our respective scar tissues when it comes to the public service, national security, as well as the transatlantic relationship. But really looking back on 100 years of U.S.-Latvian diplomatic relations, my question is, what's next? Looking forward, all of you panelists have hinted, dropped little kind of tidbits. What is next for the new generation of diaspora and Latvian compatriots? What are your aspirations and hopes for that better future and for that envisioned state that we'd like to work towards? What should we all really aspire to? Thank you.
We're looking for inspiration from you. Thanks, Diane, for the question.
See, we're all reaching for the microphone to answer first. Well, first of all, with respect to Latvia, one of the things that we haven't mentioned that's enormously important in Latvia's future is the European Union. We have oriented our comments because of who we are and who we represent around security, NATO, which is extremely important for Latvia's future. But the other equally important aspect in terms of the economic and cultural future, the political future of the country is finding its comfortable place and its influential place within the European Union. And I think that that does require them to engage in some of the reforms that you mentioned earlier. It requires resolution of the language issue. Time will do this, but it can be accelerated by wise political choices. As far as U.S.-Latvia relationship, I see this as one which can only be expected and dependent to evolve in a positive way. Because the Latvian community, in the Latvian American community, because you have an enormous reservoir of political support within the country, in Washington and around the country. So I think that there will always be, for the future, a very popular outlook for the United States to find an area of cooperation and reciprocity between the United States and Latvia that moves both of our countries forward together.
Thank you. Let's have Visma ask a question. Do we have the mic?
Thank you very much. I really appreciate you being here today and having such a wonderful presentation. One of the things I wanted to talk about is I was there in 88, 98, and sometimes in 2000 to see the transitions, as you mentioned. But the thing that struck me the last time I was there was the amount of investment by China in the property and the land that had been purchased by China. So I didn't know if that was something that was just a small, just a start to something, or if the Silk Road, there seemed to be a little bit of momentum. And I just, what's your perspective on that?
So if I may answer this question, I was ambassador in China, Latvia's ambassador in China, and I think probably I haven't done a very good job in China, but there are almost none of Chinese investments in Latvia. So there is one, regarding sequencing, but I think that we are working together also with the French companies as well, so that it's, if you look, back to this so-called 16+1, 17+1, now it's 14+1, we have left that grouping, so that I say that doesn't mean that there is no investment into Chinese, of course. I mean, Latvia told they have bought houses, they have bought properties, and they have received those temporary residence permits, but they are giving up slowly because first, I mean, it's too expensive even for them, and secondly, COVID, I mean, the COVID situation and COVID policy in China is not working and very positively towards this one. So, I mean, but if we speak about strategic investments, then we can say that we are quite safe. And if we speak about Huawei and or other Chinese technologies, I think at least within Latvian governmental systems, I mean, there are no wire from Huawei. I mean, it's either it's a Latvian or it's a European or a US made, so that we are safe at least from looking from that perspective.
Brian, did you have something to add?
Well, the only thing I would add is that I'm not particularly about Latvia, but I'm well aware of the Chinese expansion in terms of their diplomatic and their economic presence around the world. It's not just in Latvia. And we are no longer the country with the most diplomats or the most diplomatic missions. That's China. We've been surpassed. They are investing far more than the United States in all kinds of economic projects and foreign things you might call foreign aid and some of which you might call foreign business, but at any rate, the investment rate is far beyond ours. And yes, they've been handicapped a little bit lately by their COVID policy and a few other things, but there is no question that our policy towards China has got to change from what it was a few years ago, and I think it is actually changing already. So we at one point counted on economic development to aid and assist in the spread of democracy and freedom and so forth. It certainly has not worked in China much better than it has worked in Russia.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Ivan Pushkevitz, you usually have some good...
Well, yeah, my wife said I can't ask questions, but
We give you immunity. I'll talk to her.
So yes, I'm flattered and honored that several of these people on stage, these distinguished panelists, are my colleagues and friends from 20, 30 years ago. My question is, did I miss something, or did we almost have World War III this week, and did that just kind of go, it passed in the night? It's like, okay, well, we're not having World War III, so the Russians didn't bomb Poland. You know, as this happens, I just thought to myself, what more can we do in this context of today? You know, we have basically Russian propaganda has a multiplier sprinkled throughout the US media. You know, anything that they say in the Kremlin can end up on anywhere here, and it gets a lot of traction. And I guess my question is, you know, we are these in somewhat unprecedented times. Is that really the core challenge to US-Latvian relations nowadays, the volatility of these? You know, we're all very connected, but that comes with liabilities, and that the Russian propaganda machine is also very connected. And you know, what do we do about that? Thank you.
Peter, if I could respond, the answer is no, we didn't almost have World War III. NATO worked as it's designed to work. It was an event which raised questions of a nation's security. They appealed, among other things, to NATO and to Article 4 consultations. The consultations were held, and the consultations were ended with what I believe is a satisfactory resolution of it. So it worked. And in that regard, I think one should take some comfort in the currency of NATO and its infrastructure to resolve these sorts of questions and crises much short of resumption of war, but that NATO stands firmly resolved that in the event that one of its member states is attacked, its borders are exceeded, etc., that NATO as collective unit will react. And that should be a reassurance to the Baltics and Latvia in particular.
you. I don't see any other questions. It also occurs to me that we have much more comfortable chairs than the audience. So maybe they're anxious. And as one thing you maybe learned about Latvians while you were there is that we do like to have drinks. And I think, I think there's some champagne or wine planned, so maybe everyone's getting ready for that. Jim, I thought I'd written down the 7 words that you remembered Latvia by, but instead I wrote down the phrase 7 words, and not like the words. But I do remember that it was architecture, music, maybe food, gratitude. Okay, well, I wanted to maybe as a final word that each of you maybe share. This will be a soft last question, but just a favorite memory involving architecture or culture, music, food from your time in Latvia. Is there anything? And you can go first.
That was a beautiful music for that question. It's associated with, what I cherish in memory is my recollection of live Latvian music, and not necessarily from the stage at the Song Festival, but in those groups that would go through the city or in the Ethnographic Museum and put on performances there. I just love that.
A favorite memory of mine is the walk across the park. We lived in the Swedish barracks on one side of the park, and the embassy was in what was the old eye clinic on the other side of the park. And every day I walked across the park, across a little bridge, but I also passed a couple of big granite boulders on which names were carved. And those names are 2 of the young people who were killed in the Oman shootings in 1991, am I right? 1991. So it was a pleasant walk, but it was also a daily reminder of the struggle and that freedom is not free. It requires effort, it requires bloodshed, it requires willingness. And so I had a pleasant walk, but a walk of renewal every single day to and from work.
Well said, Jim, because I lived in the same place and worked in the same embassy, so I had the same walk. Ditto.
I was slower.
We did. I had a group of runners. We actually, with some difficulty, I convinced some of the Marines to run. They apparently don't really like to do that, but the ambassador insists. So we would go running in the mornings, winter and summer, and we'd run around the old town and so forth, across the bridges. But one of my favorites was to go down by the port, where you can go to Washington Square and find the original American embassy to Riga, which has a plaque, or had at least in those days, a plaque on the side of it. Does it still? Yeah. Good. Because that always kind of made me feel like me and Kenan and, we're all in this together.
Okay, so I loved all of it. The music, the art, the National Opera, the art museum, which had been renovated and opened while I was there, a stupendous renovation, the fantastic restaurants, and the magical and charming cafes. And I have to say, I just enjoyed every minute of the 4 years that I spent in Riga, and I miss it dearly.
Oh, how about Madi? How about you tell us your favorite thing about Washington?
Favorite memories from Latvia. If you look, celebrating 100 years of diplomatic relations, I would probably say working in Latvia, also with the United States, I think, a response in Latvia for 9/11. So that was, I mean, even not being a part of NATO yet, so I think that was something which we all felt. My spouse actually was working in Crisis Management Center at the government, as the Prime Minister's office, so that, you know, we felt this also in the family, you know, physically. And, well, regarding memories in US, it's still, you know, formation process, so that, but well, I
Maybe
think that
today
one-
is one of the best.
yeah, I will tell maybe, you know, after, you know, about 15, 20 years, but I think that one thing which you can bring, I mean, back from the United States is, you know, the beauty of a country in general, so all the national parks and everything else is, but if you are not speaking about politics, you know, which politician we like better and if, which not, so that I think that, you know, all the opportunities what the United States are giving us, Latvians have been living here, and also those who are here just for studies. So on my personal basis, I can say that my kids are, you know, has received, you know, American education, and that's what is helping them also to move forward in back in Latvia.
Well, I wanted to thank the panel. I wanted to let me first thank Anita Jubet, who arranged this whole panel and reached out to everyone and came up with the idea. And then, of course, I want to thank our panelists, just very interesting and erudite presentations. So thank you very much.
We'll need a group picture, yeah?